Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. I'm John Gamble, Director of Product Marketing here at Corelight. We'll get started in just a minute. We're going to give folks another minute or so to log on, and then we'll get started. Hold tight. If you're just joining us, welcome to today's webcast. We're going to get started in 60 seconds, giving people an extra minute to dial in. Thanks. All right, let's get started. Welcome to today's webcast, an introduction to threat hunting with Bro, which has recently been renamed Zeek as of October, when the open source committee met and announced a new name change. Today's webcast is presented by Corelight and Perched. We've got some great content and education in store for you guys. There is a great group of people on this call that have a wealth of knowledge about threat hunting with the Zeek framework. So please don't hesitate to ask questions. The chat panel on the left has a questions tab. So at any point during the presentation, feel free to enter a question there. We'll see it. We'll probably try to answer questions as we go. So again, please take advantage of some of the great knowledge that's going to be presenting today. Just some agenda here. I'll introduce the speakers on today's presentation. Then we'll look at Zeek and kind of give a Zeek overview and talk about how it can be used in a threat hunting capacity. Then we'll actually go through some live threat hunting demos with a real SIM that the Perch guys are going to show you. So that'll be a pretty exciting part of this presentation. Then we'll talk a bit about how Zeek can be scripted. So Zeek has its own scripting language that allows you to do custom traffic analysis tasks. Things like looking for evidence of internal beaconing in your network. Really anything you can imagine you can script with Zeek. So we'll do a little bit of a deep dive on a particular Zeek script and show you the power of that scripting capability with respect to threat hunting. And lastly, if there's any questions that we didn't get to during the presentation, we'll save some time, about 5 to 10 minutes at the end, for questions. So with that, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We've got Richard Chitamitre. Richard's a technology evangelist at Corelight. Prior to that, he served as a senior security analyst at Edward Jones. And before that, he spent over a decade in the US Navy in a number of different cybersecurity roles, including work on the tailored access operations team. We're also joined today by Jonathon Hall. Jonathon is a senior solutions engineer at Perched. And prior to his work at Perched, he was a senior cybersecurity analyst at Strategic Staffing Solutions. And prior to that, also spent 6 years serving in the US Navy as a network cybersecurity defense analyst. We have a bonus speaker today as well. We're joined by Andrew Pease, co-founder of Perched, who's also going to talk a bit about his background threat hunting with the Zeek framework. So we've got 3 people who've just got a great wealth of knowledge and operational experience using Zeek to threat hunt. So if you have a threat hunting team that you're working on building out, or you're thinking about building a team out, do not hesitate to ask a question. These gentlemen have seen so much in their careers and have just a ton of knowledge about how Zeek can be applied in your environment to help defend your organization. So with that, we're going to talk about Zeek and how it can be used in a threat hunting capacity, but we just kind of want to level set everyone and make sure that everybody on the call has kind of the same understanding of what Zeek is and its capabilities. So Chit, Richard, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome, thanks, John. So, when I started out, I did not know what Zeek was. And when I came to a realization of how we were doing threat hunting and, going through IDS alerts, it was kind of that aha moment when I realized, hey, there's a better way to do it. So what is Zeek? So Zeek is actually an open source network security monitoring tool. It's been around since 1995. It was invented by Vern Paxson at LBNL, and just up until recently, it was known as Bro. So if I ever say Bro, I mean Zeek, and when I mean Zeek, when I say Zeek, I mean Zeek. So right now, it's currently used by a lot of organizations globally, and it's used in a variety of different ways, from using for the normal security intrusion sets, or to kind of use for looking at network statistics. So the kind of three things that I want to go over are the three things that Bro is mainly used for, is for traffic logging. So it is used to do protocol analysis, and by extension creates a wide variety of logs. Also, there is a key feature inside Zeek, which is file extraction. So instead of actually having to capture PCAP and then do file carving out of it, you can actually extract it on the network, off the network easily. And then the last piece is the custom traffic analysis, which is actually referring to the scripting language. So just because there are, protocol analyzers out there that are not yet supported by Zeek, you can go and do a little bit of research and then write your own custom analysis for it. So the question has always been, how is Zeek deployed? Well, Zeek sensors are deployed out of band. And the reason why you do that is so you're not interfering with operations. So just because you're running it through passively doesn't mean that you can't actively look for threats. So you're hitting things in near real time. So it sits off usually a packet broker or spam port or mirror port or tap. And what it does is it takes that network data feed and then turns it into the Zeek log. And from there, you're going to feed it either into a SIM or a data lake, where you're going to do a lot of different post analysis on it. With the scripting outputs, though, you can actually do pre-analysis on it. So that way you can actually see, hey, if I want to look for beaconing, or I want to look for something, or I want to build a custom log with all the security metadata in it, I can do that. And then with the extracted files, you can send it to an FTP server or to any file scanning framework that you want. So when I was working at NSA in tailored access operation, one of the main things that you would do when you exploit onto a box is to cover your tracks, right? So with a cards exchange principle, usually that's what happens is anytime you interact with something, with data, you leave evidence behind. Well, as people get smarter, they're realizing, hey, I need to cover up my tracks. Well, unfortunately, when you're going on the network, you can't hide in the network unless you're encrypting yourself. But then it's still very obvious based off of the way you're traversing through the network. So the comprehensive logs means that attackers can't hide. That means that any time of transactions that they do, whether it's exploiting HTTP server, you might be able to clean up web logs, but you're not going to be able to cover the tracks of you actually accessing that server. So with that, there's a ton of data that is generated by Zeek. So it turns that raw network traffic into comprehensive logs that you can actually index, so you can search and do a lot of analysis on the back end. A little bit about it is that it generates about 35 plus different network protocols, and then there's over 400 data fields extracted from that protocol and that protocol analyzer. And then those extracted data fields were actually selected by, security analysts, people who were doing computer science research, and realized these are the fields that we need in order to actually make use of these logs. But recently, at BroCon, Seth Hall just announced that he just revamped HTTP. So that just means that, just because an analyzer is written and log format is created, doesn't mean that it's set in stone. So that means that because we have a vast amount of people in the community, you can actually, say, hey, I believe it should look like this. And it's because I'm an expert at this protocol. And so just because something is written doesn't mean it's set in stone. So here is a quick look at kind of the differences between, Zeek DNS log versus a traditional DNS server log. So DNS server logs usually tell you exactly what's going on, and it's just kind of telling you, hey, we want to look at the query, and this is what it is, and that's it. Well, with Zeek, you get kind of things like the microsecond timestamp for transactions, the connection unique identifier to see if anything else kicked off during that. So it's a pivotable field. You get the normal 5-tuple record call, and then you get the round trip time, and then the content of the response. So with that, that means that you get both the query and the answers, not necessarily just the query by itself. And so by doing that, you can see that like there are certain fields that overlap inside each of the logs. Timestamps are a good use of it because that way you can actually see, without a doubt, everything that transpired in order based off of how it occurred via the timestamp. Then you can look at the UID for unique identifiers to pivot to see if that connection created any new protocol in that connection. So that way you can see, whether a DNS request actually kicked off to go to an HTTP website, doing a GET request, whether that, HTTP GET request became GET for a file, and whether that file was downloaded, or looking at SMTP where, whether or not that link that you clicked created a DNS or an HTTP request. So a little bit about Corelight. So we were founded in 2013, and we're headquartered in San Francisco. The Corelight sensors themselves are essentially, very customized platforms that specify like creating Bro or making Bro a little bit more enterprise ready. So we make it easy for deployment. So essentially you can take a Corelight sensor, plug it into a network tap, and in 15 minutes be ready to go by transferring that data to your SIM. So it's minutes and not months to deployment, and you're going to get 10 times the peak performance gains over trying to do an open source deployment. There's a lot of out-of-box integrations where we immediately, we run Kafka underneath the engine. We use Kafka to send to different things like Elastic or to Splunk directly or via syslog or TCP JSON streaming. And then we also provide things that Open Source Bro does not have out of the box, which is performance monitoring. So that means that you can see everything that's going on the sensor, understanding if you're getting packet drops, understanding the log rates that are being generated, so that way you know what's going on. And we also provide a sensor management console. So a little bit of my experiences hunting with Zeek. So I was introduced to Zeek probably about 4 or 5 years ago. And when I was introduced to it, it was kind of a game changer for me because originally what I used to do was I would get an IDS alert from Snort, and then I'd have to go and see if any PCAP was actually generated from that alert. And when I went through it, I had to go, piece by piece to look through whether or not, it was a false positive or it was true. And then when it was true, I had to kind of gather more data by going to the host or figuring out what was actually occurring on the network. And that was very difficult because when you only have very little disparate log sources, it's a big jigsaw puzzle that you just have to put together to do it. And by doing it, a lot of times, after an event occurred, I'd have like a 2-hour time period where I was able to write a report, which, 2 hours is I would think unacceptable for people who are looking to do incident response or threat hunting. When I worked at Edward Jones, I did a lot of analysis with SMTP where I would look at it to see if we were getting phishing emails. And by actually looking at Bro logs, or Zeek logs, I was able to determine, the severity of all the phishing attacks that were going on.
Awesome. Thank you, Chit. We're going to turn it over to the Perched guys, Jonathon and Andrew.
Thanks, Chit. Great rundown there, and thank you for the intro, John. So just a little bit of background about myself. Chief Intelligence Officer and one of the co-founders at Perched. Prior to that, I worked as a threat intelligence lead and incident response lead at Monsanto. I built the incident response security operations, security monitoring program there. And then in 2013, created an intelligence program there that focused on everything from online extremism all the way to insider threats. And I've spent over 17 years in the Missouri National Guard. I currently lead cyber hunt operations for the Missouri National Guard. Okay, so a little bit about Perched. So forged in the open source. We truly believe at Perched, is one of the reasons that we founded the company, was we really believe in the strength of the open source community and how it is continually able to be a disruptive innovator in a way that closed source software just is always kind of trying to catch up with open source. And so we truly believe in it, and it's one of the reasons that we have gotten really strongly behind the Bro and now Zeek projects. In 2014, we created an open source network security monitoring solution built on top of Bro called ROC NSM. And in 2016, we open sourced it, and it has been very widely adopted as a great open source turnkey solution for people that want to use Bro, either at small scales at their home or all the way up to Fortune 100 financial services companies. And there's really what we have built ourselves on top of is around ROC and built up and do support around the ROC NSM project. We do security analytics, and we use Bro to do a lot of that kind of stuff. And people really look at Bro in a security context, but all the time that we've spent with it, we realize that we can do network operations from detecting health and uptime and a variety of other things about how your network is performing, traditional security and incident response functions, and then also can do hunt operations. So Bro is one of those kind of Swiss Army tools that can do a lot of different things and at a lot of different contexts. We focus on working with Zeek with our partners and also with our, inside of supporting our open source projects. And for example, one of our partners, obviously Corelight, has been doing a great job of inserting this great open source protocol and metadata analyzer into so many organizations and places that it never had been before. And so that's one of the things that we do with our partners is help do some systems integration with Corelight and other open source projects into existing ecosystems that are in some of these clients. And then some of the services that we do is we do tailored training and education. I'll talk about that a little bit on the next slide. And then again, consulting with our partners and around the open source projects. So the training and education, and people ask us all the time, why do we say training and education? And this is kind of long lessons that we've learned about. Training is really teaching about the tool. How do we turn it on and off? How do we make it function? How do we make the lights turn on and off? That sort of thing like that. And then education is really about critical thinking, applying the tools to your specific use cases. So we've all been to training sometimes where they teach you all these great things, and then you go back and this is not exactly what you're inside of your environment. So it's hard to kind of take and forklift what you learned in training and apply it to your use cases. So that's where we really approach the education concept, is how do we critically think about our problem and our data set, and how do we use the tool at our disposal to answer those questions about our data. We have tracks, education tracks that are broken into multiple different training pipelines. The four that we focus on mostly around foundations, and that is really kind of an introduction to leveraging and using Bro as a hunting platform. Operations, which is actually doing hunt operations, and an analyst track, which is really around doing intelligence analysis on all the data you're collecting, and how is that informing and prioritizing your investments for what you're going to do to enhance and change your visibility. And then engineering is really around building open source Bro and other data visualization platforms, and how do you get those to work together, and how do you tune those and really get the most that you want out of there. We have additional training courses that we do around threat hunting, and some of that threat hunting is again around using native Bro or using ROC or using Corelight or other partners to do hunt operations inside of your environment. And then again, we also have training tracks that are focused around traditional security operations. Signature-based intrusion detections or antiviruses, other things like that. While they're not catching the most advanced stuff, it's still table stakes, and people still need to know how to do those. And we use Bro to do a lot of traditional security and network operations, and we teach teams how to use those at scale. Our approach to consulting is a little different than normal, and again, this is from long history we've had in the private sector. Is you would have consultants that come out and maybe spend a month or 2 months with you, but of that, they're only getting about 60% of that time actually doing something. The rest of the time they are spending working through bureaucratic processes, or trying to get TAP put in the right spot, or trying to get certain logging enabled, or change control boards, and all of that stuff really slows down the consultant's ability to do work. So our approach to consulting is we kind of look at it like a special forces group, is that we come in for 2 weeks, we twist wrenches and solve a lot of problems, and then leave our clients with a roadmap of things that they need to accomplish before we can come back. And then we come back in a month or so when all those things are ready, and spend the entire time just solving problems, instead of spending time trying to figure out how to get to the next step. We do a lot of systems integration. So A lot of it is around connecting Bro into existing ecosystems and also ancillary services. So Kafka, as a great example, is becoming a de facto tool inside of network monitoring. We help people a lot with integrating Kafka, for example, into how they're doing NSM. And the final part that we do around consulting is really around doing security analytics and use cases. So helping build out machine learning jobs and save searches and alert rules and dashboarding so that people can do, they can take those hunt operations they learn in training and apply those into their environment. They have to spend a lot of time building all that stuff out. We can help them do that as well. And Jonathon, who's coming up next, will kind of talk about how we do that a little differently.
Yeah, so my experience with Bro and Zeek, I've been doing network hunting my entire time that I've been in this career field. So I specialized in, and one of the big things that bothered me when I first started was we were always looking at alerts. So we were always just looking at all these red flashing lights essentially that went off and said, hey, something bad happened, go take care of it. But what bothered me about that was we weren't looking for anything new. Like we hardly ever added new signatures. We weren't updating them. So what about all the new things that were happening? So the answer we originally got was, oh, we'll dig through the PCAP, which just didn't make a lot of sense when we started doing it because there was just tons and tons and tons of it. The PCAP they gave us was about a second for about 3 gigs worth of PCAP, and there wasn't even full sessions inside of there. So it kind of brought up the question of how do we do this better, how we find something. So we ran across Bro, and it was a huge game changer for us because not only were we able to cut down the amount of PCAP into much smaller bite-size and digestible pieces, but we were also able to sessionize it, which made everything as an originator and responder and kind of opened up a whole new world of analytics to myself and my team. So where we were so used to looking at everything as a source and destination and having to go and look at SYN and SYNAX, now all of a sudden I could put in things like, hey, just show me all of my people that originated requests outside my network, and that was something that was available. So what I want to do is, rather than just continually talk about my experience with it, I actually want to jump into a demo and I'll walk you through it. It's not terribly complicated. It's pretty simple, but I didn't want to go too overboard in something this short time frame. So just go ahead and jump in it. So I'm going to be using Kibana as my tool of choice to kind of view these Bro logs. I have pre-built a lot of my dashboards. They're not terribly complicated. Most of them are pretty straightforward. So for example, here we go and look at my flow log. It'd be helpful if I get the right time frame real quick. So I've seeded some previous data on August 1st. So inside of my flow log, this is essentially just the Bro con log. So if you're familiar with Bro or Zeek logs, then you'll know that this is just information about the actual connections that are happening. The reason that Kibana is my tool of choice is because with my dashboards, I can dynamically update what I'm looking at by clicking or dragging. And that really enables me as an analyst to be able to dig through things a lot faster. There's other tools out there, but most of them don't do the dynamic updating, which brings me back to a raw query, which is helpful, but I can notice anomalies and visualizations much faster than I can just raw text. So my first kind of step when I'm using this is we want to start just looking for low-hanging fruit. One of the things that I think a lot of analysts tend to forget is that at the end of the day, this is a human-on-human conflict. I'm not trying to get some sort of botnet or some sort of automated thing out of my network. There's another human on the other side that programmed this to do something, and it's going to benefit them in some way, which means that more than likely that human messed up somewhere or made some sort of mistake. So I want to find the things that aren't working 100% exactly as they should. So to do that, I'm just going to kind of take a broad overview of my network and kind of take some mental notes. There's nothing that stands out a whole lot inside of my first one was protocols over time. It looks pretty normal. It's what I would expect. Most traffic is going to be TCP and then UDP and then some ICMP in there. So what I'm really looking for is like huge UDP spikes above TCP, or ICMP being a lot higher than basically being almost invisible. It's a little hard to see because there's very little of it, but that's what I kind of expect. So we come down. There is a pretty large amount of bytes that seem to be either coming in or out of my network, but there is not enough for me to just immediately jump down the rabbit hole, start digging into this. So we can keep scrolling down and see who my top talkers are. My internal hosts are pretty chatty, especially this guy. But again, nothing that's so out of the ordinary that it might, send any red alerts. Maybe that guy happened to come in for a full day and the other two took off during lunch and never came back. So just kind of are looking for those low-hanging fruits. We can see that we've got some protocols that are identified by Bro, which is really helpful. So that means that of these 10,000 things over port 80, at least 7,000 of them were actual HTTP. So I do have some anomalies here, because that means that there's stuff going over port 80 that's not recognized as HTTP, but that's not necessarily somewhere I want to start, because that could also, just as experience has shown me, it can tend to be a large rabbit hole. So I'm looking for even lower hanging fruit than that. Final dashboard down here on the flow is just my hosts, and basically taking this very top one up here, so my data over time, and now breaking it up by individual hosts. So now it looks a little bit different, because I can see that my 53 in the network has decided to send quite a bit of data, but that's not necessarily represented up here as well, because I have so many other hosts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mentally note that the 53 is sending a lot of data at this time, but again, it might not necessarily be anything bad. So what I would do is I would maybe check some of my other dashboards. So I know that it's really common for attackers to want to use something that can get in and out of my network. There's no way for them to magically will themselves onto my network. They have to come in and out. So they're probably going to use a protocol that I have to allow in and out. Maybe HTTP, maybe some SSL over HTTPS, maybe even DNS. So the reason I'm going to start with HTTP is just because it's unencrypted. I can get some really good metadata from Bro. We can see that most of the stuff is looking pretty normal. I expect mostly GET requests, some posts, some options in the head are fine. So there's no crazy HTTP methods being used out there. We primarily have a bunch of stuff going across, which is pretty normal for the web. What does pop out kind of immediately to me is that of all the HTTP that Bro said, hey, this is definitely HTTP, one of those happens to not be over port 80. It's over this really high port, 18,560. Now, I could host a web server over that port. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just weird. It's not the normal, it's not the standard. So if I wanted to dig into it, it's really easy. I just click the plus in Kibana, which then pulls up the actual host. So now I have an IP address. See that it's a GIF. Looks like it's from some sort of spot ad. So kind of looking through this, like there's not a lot of stuff that necessarily points out and says, hey, this is absolutely bad. It's just kind of weird. I also noticed that there's a 302, which typically means that there's a redirect. So I don't really have a lot to go off of this, but I could take this guy and I could pivot to some of my other dashboards. So what I'm gonna do is I can either copy this or I can post it up here and pin it in Kibana. And since he redirected and it wasn't in HTTP, I would guess that more than likely what happened is he redirected over to SSL, which we can see that he does show up in SSL as well. So same IP address, similar spot ad, certificate comes back as okay. So we're now looking at a encrypted protocol, so I can't get a ton out of this, but there's still definitely some useful information. So the big things that I really go to on this are my certificates. And here we notice that they've actually paid for a certificate from GoDaddy. Seems fairly normal. So I could continue down this rabbit hole at this moment, or I could just kind of say, hey, you know what, this wasn't as low-hanging fruit as I thought it was, so maybe I'll move on, because nothing seems or jumps out as malicious. So when we do that, just because I happen to be sitting on this page, I can just continue looking for low-hanging fruit in SSL. And what's really interesting, something that jumps out immediately, is these unable to get local issuer certificates that Bro's reporting. And then also we have some expired certificates, both of which are pretty concerning to me. But I'm going to look at these ones first, because these are usually an indicator of a self-signed cert or somebody that did not want to pay for their cert or didn't generate them correctly. From here, I still have a few hosts that are popping up. So not necessarily any of them are doing anything malicious. Maybe they're just lazy, or maybe these are some sort of internal website. But I see that some of it's over 8080. A little bit weird. That's the alternate port for HTTP. They really should be using 8443 as the alternate. Again, not necessarily malicious, but if we scroll down, what really pops out is when we get down to the certificates. So if you look at this line here, notice that it basically looks like somebody headbutted their keyboard and pressed send and said, yep, good to go. That's not how this works. We don't just headbutt keyboards, press send, and say, yeah, everything's going to be great. So in my experience, this is a sign of somebody that doesn't really understand the certificates they're generating, and they think, oh, maybe I'm being, real smart and I'm hiding myself, or I'm trying to blend in, and really it just stands out because it's not correct. So I want to look at that, because 9 out of 10 times it's usually malicious. And when I do that, I come across an IP address and I run across a server name. So the server name is blog.disinterestingdomain.com, which becomes interesting. So as much as they want me to be disinterested, I become interested. And the way that I can look at this guy in more depth, if we go back to our original flow log, which is just showing me general connections, I can use the power of Kibana to search for him by putting an AND query in there and the IP address, which now just shows me all of the traffic related to this guy. And there's some things that worry me right away when I look at this. So I see that Bro's detected some FTP, and not only that, it's detected data being sent over FTP. So some other things that pop out right away, we have SSL traffic and we have 443, but they don't line up at all. So if I were to say, hey Bro, what was the SSL over? It's over port 8080. All right, well, in that case, don't show that to me, but what's going on with all this 443 traffic that they're supposedly trying to masquerade as SSL? And we can scroll down, we can see that there is indeed bytes being sent. And this is pretty common for any kind of beaconing activity. So Bro gives you a con state and a history field. The con state is going to be a basically lettered code. There's several of them, and it's going to kind of tell you some information about how that is. And the rejected state typically means that the responder, in this case, or the server, has sent a reset and said, hey, I don't feel like talking to you. So if we look at the history field, when we look at this, the history field is what they call a uniqueified field. And basically, it's going to keep track of those actual TCP flags that we're used to seeing when we're doing packet analysis, like the SYN, SYNAC, and so forth, but it only keeps track of one of them. So if the originator was to send a SYN and then sent another one, Bro won't keep track of that because it already tracked one of them. So just be aware that when using this, that you're not going to see it in the exact order that it happened. But in this case, we know that at least what happened was a SYN was sent and a reset was set. There could have been multiple SYNs before the reset or even multiple resets, but that's not necessarily anything at this level that we care about. What we care about is that my host tried to connect to somebody, they sent a reset, and then what's really interesting is if I get rid of the reject, at some point he was successfully able to connect over this unknown protocol and send data, quite a bit of it. So at this point, I would say that we're pretty sure, 99% sure that this is malicious. And luckily we have an FTP dashboard. So we could go there and we could see some other interesting things about it. So one of the things I can see is I can see that my host originated it out, which means that it's not my FTP server. It's actually the adversary's FTP server. And they seem to not be super familiar with everything that's going on, because they had to run this command to try and steal my too many secrets document multiple times, because it didn't complete every time. They were only able to successfully transfer it once. So it's just some interesting things that we can gain about our adversary, understanding that maybe he's not as well versed as maybe we all thought he was. The other thing that I wanted to kind of demo is just do a quick demo of Graph. So I get a lot of questions revolving around how do I use bro data in Graph, especially with Kibana. So in general, when you're using Kibana, you want to take dashboards and you want to start out really wide with as much data as possible. And that's what you notice that I did when I started out on the flow dashboard. I just said, hey, show me everything over that time period. I never actually filtered any of this out time-wise. And so from there, I used the other subfields inside of Bro to filter down to find my anomaly. With Graph, however, it works a little bit opposite. We want to be able to start from a small point and work our way up. So to kind of show you a useful example, so the other thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we turn off the significant links. We change certainty to 1, because by default, it's going to allow Elasticsearch to decide what's a popular term. And the certainty means that the event needed to happen at least 3 times, which my adversary might not do the same thing 3 times. So I want to make sure that I can see what happened, because if there's a bro log for it, that means it happened. And that's all I care about. So to do this, I'm going to add a couple of fields. So I want an originating host, my responding host and port. Just add these real quickly. I'm also going to add in the HTTP host field, which will be the domain name. And I'm going to add the SSL server name, which is, these are all bro fields, and that will contain the server name of the website if it's using SSL. Just fix some colors. We'll do blue for responders, blue for originators, red for responders. So we'll just want our bad guys red. And do a green website for unencrypted and a yellow web page for encrypted. So to start this off, I'm going to shift click all these off, and I want to only get my responding host that was our bad guy. So I'm going to put that in there, and you'll notice that all I get is the one little bubble here, which is what I want. I want to start out small. And then from here, I can basically allow Graph to start taking over the operations for me. So I'm going to unselect my responding host, highlight the originator. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click this expand selection. And because on each of these, I said maximum of 5, every time I have it expand, it'll expand up to 5 terms if they're available. So when I do that, I only have one host that's actually talking to him, which is good for me as a defender, because now I only have to worry about one host unless he did any kind of internally pivoting. So I know that the 53 is infected, but no one else on my network was. And the reason I know that no one else was is Graph does not take into consideration time, unlike everything else in Kibana. Everything else is time-based. This just looked across all of my data in the bro index and said, is anybody related? And only he was. Well, that's good. So some of the other things I can do is I can make sure, well, did I miss anything as far as ports go? And we saw all of these inside of the flow dashboard and hit it again. So these are the 5 ports. There was no other ports used. And what I could then do is I could select each of my ports and say, well, was there any HTTP websites associated with them? Which there wasn't, so that's good. and then I can reselect the SSL website. And so here's where it trips up a lot of people. So they think, oh, well, all these websites just showed up on 443, and so that must mean that I can go from the 104 to the 443, and then he's associated with all of these. That's not actually how it works. You can only connect dots that are directly connected by a line. So to find out which SSL sites he's associated with, we actually need to select him, hit the plus, and then if I wanted to find out, are any of the existing ones connected, I could highlight each of those, and I could click this link button. Now, because it bounces, we can see that none of those are associated. So then what I could do to find out, oh, I want to know what port the blog.thisinteresting domain is actually attached to, we can do the same thing. So we select that, select all the ports, and then we're going to click the link. And we can see that it links to the 8080. So now we're able to see that this and this are connected. So blog.thisinteresting to the 104, and the 104 is using port 8080, and port 8080 is also connected to the blog.thisinteresting domain. So with that, I'm going to turn back over to our friends at Corelight.
Awesome. Thank you, Jonathan. We had a few questions that came in as a result of your demo, so maybe we could just knock them down right now. There was a question about how Zeek Bro is seeing host data, and a specific question about how you can map an IP with a host name. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So mapping, let's take the last one first, because unfortunately I don't remember the first one. So the last question, mapping a host name to an IP address, you would do it at the Bro level, and you can have it basically look to see if there is any host names available inside of the actual packets, and then you can extract that field, and then you'd be able to add it in and be able to use that in your Kibana analysis. And what was the first question?
The first one was just kind of a general question about how Zeek is seeing host data, and you know, I think the general answer there is there's just a ton of host information that's crossing the network at any given time, and it's pulling it down depending on what protocol is being communicated over.
Right. Yes. So with that, there's a lot of stuff that you can enable to pull that information. If you look at packet data, almost all the time in the packet data, you've got the MAC layer as well. And with the MAC layer, it typically includes the host names, and that's how you're going to be able to get host names in there. All the host names that I displayed in the demo were all websites. So those were all going to be included in the actual URL or the request itself.
Yep. And we also had one more question. It was about how does Zeek handle and analyze encrypted traffic? Chit, maybe you could comment on that, because it actually kind of ties into your next section of this presentation.
Yeah, so for encrypted traffic, we're not doing SSL break and inspect, and so we're not going to see it unless it is unencrypted. But however, we're still going to get the transaction data, including connection, so the 5-tuple data, including the bytes used, the SSL certificate, so that means the X509 is being generated. And if you have file extraction on, you can actually extract the certificate itself and do analysis on that. And then that actually kind of jumped into the next topic that I was going to talk about, which is scripting with Zeek. So Zeek is very powerful because it is not just a rigid protocol analyzer. It means that you can, if you have a protocol you want to build for, you can actually build it. So soon we're going to be releasing in the Zeek community Spicy, which is going to allow you to be able to create protocol analyzers on the fly without having to, learn BinPAC and go into a lot of pain into scripting those out specifically. So what's nice is that you can do a lot of automation with traffic analysis with Zeek. So that means that if you know certain things that are going on in your network that shouldn't be going on, you can actually start scripting for it and create Zeek notice logs. And that's very nice because that means that you can kind of automate and pre-process to say, hey, without having to do any post-process work on the data that I'm getting to massage it, I know for a fact what's going on. And then so What's nice is that there is a bunch of scripts out there in the Zeek community. So, there is 60 plus scripts on GitHub and in the package manager. And so you can actually go out and see what someone's created and then take it and then expand upon it if you need to, or you can use it as is and, run with it, which is really nice. And the next topic would be for JA3, which was created by Salesforce. So a little bit about JA3. So JA3 was created by 3 guys at Salesforce. And it was basically on the idea principle that, we want to look at the SSL client hello behavior and kind of fingerprint it so that way we can start, identifying all the different clients out there that are doing communication over encrypted communication networks. So what JA3 does is it takes out the fields of the SSL client hello. So this is, TLS, but we're going to say SSL for simplicity's sake. So it takes out the SSL version, the cipher, the SSL extension, the elliptic curve, and the elliptic curve point format. And the example is down below. So it takes that, it then runs it through and does an MD5 hash to create a easily consumable 32 character fingerprint. So, and it turns it into this. So this becomes a very unique identifier. And what's nice is that JA3S, which has just been released this year by Salesforce as well, is the server-side version of it. So it takes, the 3 points of fields and then also hashes those so you get a unique identifier. So what this means is that JA3 isn't necessarily dependent on the MD5 hash or the SHA-1 hash of the X509 cert itself. So if you ever visit sites like abuse.ch, they actually have a running blacklist of bad SSL certificates. So these are SSL certificates that are known use in malware or botnets. So what's nice about that, because it's identifying the actual communication frame, it means that any malware or any program that uses SSL as a communication method, there's going to be a JA3 fingerprint that's very unique to it. So that'll be the same even if the X509 cert changes. So regardless of any of these changes that occur. And then by pairing JA3 and JA3S fingerprints, you can get very unique rare communications between servers and clients. So a little bit about that, it would be like, if you had an Amazon cert and it was calling back to Amazon normal infrastructure, and it was going to an ad space and doing communication like Jonathon was showing earlier, and then suddenly you get a new call out to a different space. It could be that they're using that Amazon cert to communicate to their C2 infrastructure. And so things like that allow for broad-based analysis, and then you can use this over time. Another thing is that you can also identify all the different programs and clients that are used internally. So you know that if any JA3 that doesn't match your internal whitelist, you could say, hey, this is a non-standard SSL communication, whether it is on 443 or non-standard port 8080 or 8443.
Awesome. Thank you, Chit, Jonathon, and Andrew. With that, we're now in the Q&A section. We've got just about 10 minutes left and a number of questions. So let's see if we can get to all of them. We had a question to follow up on a question that was asked earlier about the host visibility. Can you talk more about the types of host information that you're going to see in Zeek logs and how that might differ from what you could see from endpoint agents? Andrew, maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Yep, sure, absolutely. This question comes up pretty frequently around this is how do we get that host data? And we have a lot of variety of various different ways that you can generate host data and shoot it across your network. And then we can use sensors to carve that data off. So one way that we've had clients that have had a lot of different specific use cases on it, but one of the most generic ones that we talk, and then usually it grows into a more complex way of actually accomplishing it. But using syslog, like nxlog or something like that on an endpoint to fire syslog data at an IP address that's not necessarily listening for port 53 traffic, it drops it on the ground and it doesn't go anywhere, which is fine. You're not giving the attacker any additional surface to go after. But if you have a sensor placed as that's crossing the sensor, you can carve that syslog off and convert it into JSON and dump it into Elasticsearch. And so that gives you the ability to look at endpoint data that is crossing the network, and you can carve that off with a sensor. So that's been one of the ways that we've gotten host data. And there's a variety of different ways on if you're going to do encrypted UDP and things like that. But that's just one of the high-level ways that you can get a lot of host endpoint data without actually poking your nose into a contested environment.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think that's a great point. That last point in particular is one of the great things about Zeek is that it's relatively frictionless compared to installing endpoint agents and making sure that they're up and running and patched and all of that. Zeek, you can just tap from a central point and get a ton of visibility, passive visibility on what your hosts are doing without ever having to interfere with those hosts. So that's a great point you made there at the end. I just want to reiterate. Let's see, we've got a couple of questions here. Chit, maybe I'll give this one to you. Do you think Zeek logs can replace PCAP, or how do you think about the relationship between the two of them?
So that the question, the answer to that is like yes and no. Ooh, am I getting a feedback?
I'm not hearing any feedback on my side. You're hearing feedback?
Oh, I'm hearing a little bit. I'm just hearing a little bit on my side. It might be my headphones. Actually, no, I'm not hearing it anymore. But the question for that is Zeek a replacement for PCAP? Yes and no. In certain situations, it can. So depending on where you're collecting PCAP data, if it's very heavy and you can't afford to do PCAP solution, Zeek is a great way to get 99% of the data in an easy format that is easily consumable. So the other side of that is no, it's not, because PCAP is literally a copy of network traffic. So that means that you're going to have unequivocal data, but it depends on what that data is. So if it's encrypted, potentially you're not going to get a lot of value out of it unless you can do SSL break and inspect on the back end. So really what you can do with it is you can do two ways. You can use it to augment current PCAP solution, kind of use it as a way of, identifying like, hey, event occurred, let's go and actually dive in to PCAP and actually say, hey, what section of PCAP do we actually need to trim instead of doing a full gig? So that way we can actually get 5 tuple data. We can start carving the PCAP using, using Wireshark, and then drilling down a little bit better to find that data.
Thanks, Chit. Let's see. How about, here's a question for you, Chit, but also Andrew and Jonathan. Please chime in if you have examples as well. Chit, you were talking about the J3 scripts. Do you have other examples of community scripts that you would recommend using?
So yeah, there's a ton of scripts that are being shared in the community. One of the scripts that I actually recommend is the Bro long connections. So a lot of times when you're seeing long connections, that actually is very abnormal, because a lot of times TCP transactions, you do a handshake, it lasts for a few seconds, you do a GET request, and then suddenly you get the data, and then either you send another request or it times out and it's done. But if you see a long connection, something that lasts, hours or days or weeks, then that is something that is pretty hard to pass up as normal, because now you're going to have to start digging in. And what's nice is because normally the connection log does not do that. So the connection log is waiting for the fin or the reset in order to kind of log that to the connection log. But if you're looking at Bro log connections, it helps a lot. And the second one is for people who are worried about like DLP, so data loss protection. There is one called the producer-consumer ratio that is kind of good. It's kind of bad. It uses some stats. So it kind of tracks the flow from receiving, from originating and receiving and responding hosts. So what it does is it gives you a number between -1 and 1. So whether they're consuming data or producing data. What that means is that, like, if you start identifying all the different assets on your network from servers and hosts, if a host is producing more data than it's consuming, that should be a cause for action, especially if you start looking at over time and you start seeing that bit switch from a negative to a positive where it is producing more than it's consuming, then that can be, something of data exfiltration or somebody actually, hosting a server that they shouldn't be, along those lines.
Thanks, Chit. Jonathan, Andrew, anything to comment on Zeek scripts, either you've written or used in the community you found helpful?
Yeah, I think the other one that we found really helpful, and this isn't a script, it's actually a protocol analyzer that's part of the Community Bro project and still on the open source side. But something that trips up a lot of junior analysts is one of the places that people like to dive first is going into DNS logs. And they get really excited when they see port 137 in DNS logs and think that they've got somebody doing some weird tunneling. But it's one of the ways that Bro seems to process NetBIOS traffic, that it dumps it into the DNS.log file. So in the Community Bro, they've actually released a protocol analyzer specifically for NetBIOS that is really going to help carve that stuff out. And if you're experienced, it's easy to filter that stuff out, but it really helps with alert fatigue, and that you're not going to have people getting excited about things that is just the way that Bro manages that protocol. So that's something that is pretty exciting. It's not necessarily a script, but it's an extension of the protocol analyzers.
Awesome, thanks. Another question here. Do you guys have favorite queries when you're sitting down at your console for threat hunting when Zeek logs? I guess I think I'm probably just asking if you guys have any favorite kind of gotcha low-hanging fruit type queries for threat hunting.
Yeah, so some of my favorite ones to do using Kibana, so all my queries are going to be related to that tool, but I really enjoy being able to take the IP addresses of the network I'm defending and saying, show me everything that's originating from internal and everything that's not going to internal, or even being able to say, show me only the internal to internal. And what that allows me to do is with my dashboards, it can kind of break out the way that traffic appears differently. So now I'm looking at all of my graphs and all of my visualizations for everything that's leaving my network. And then I can also change it to where I only want to see all of my hosts talking to only themselves. And really there's a third option as well, where you can say, hey, show me all of the network data that originated outside and successfully made it into my network. I would say the last one is helpful if you are actually allowing stuff in, but majority of the time I see attackers get in through email, so it's usually going to be some form of they've downloaded and clicked something they weren't supposed to. So most of the time you don't really get a lot of great things from that third one, but if you happen to have a vulnerable service, it makes things really easy to be able to pinpoint that out, because very few things typically get into your network from outside.
My favorite query actually is coming from using Splunk. So Splunk has kind of some really cool operators that you can use. And one of that is looking at like character lengths. So what I did was I did a query on DNS logs, and I was actually very interested in queries and answers. And what I ended up looking for was any query that had a string longer than like 25 or 30 characters. And what was nice is that you kind of get to see, like, potentially over time, especially if you actually cast a wide net on the range, you can start seeing either like, unique strings that are being generated, so rare DNS queries, and potentially those add up over time. So either it's DNS beaconing that's been encoded, or it could potentially be DNS exfiltration.
Yeah, this is Andy. I think my favorite to do on that, first off, Chit, that's a great one. One of the ones that I like to do is looking for low port to high port and high port to high port communication, especially crossing domain boundaries. So I have a safe search that is one of the first things I fire off in Kibana, is to see, are people communicating? Generally speaking, you're talking people going from a high port to a low port for normal network communications generally. And so when you see people going the other direction from low to high or high to high, it's just stuff that I like to look at that can really kind of identify some, again, low-hanging fruit, which the genesis of the question.
Awesome, thanks guys. Well, we're at the top of the hour here, so I think we're gonna wrap up. You can see our contact information there up on screen. That's inquiries@perched.io or info@corelight.com if you'd like to follow up for more information or schedule a demo or just a call. We're happy to set that up. There will be a recorded version of this broadcast made available, so don't worry if you'd like to share this with colleagues. We got a few questions during the presentation about that. You will be able to share this with colleagues. Just as a closing thought, a question I'll put to you guys, if one of you has an answer you'd like to give, jump in. How would you frame, if there's an analyst who doesn't have Zeek in their environment right now but wants it, what would be the 1 or 2 sentences you would tell them to help them sell that up the chain to their boss to get the Zeek in their environment?
I think one of the things that Zeek has done that's really been powerful is because it does protocol analysis, it helps you prioritize your investments to improve your visibility. And so I think that's a big thing that people always say is we don't know what we don't know, and we know we have visibility gaps, and we don't know where we should start looking first. And Bro has the ability to look across a lot of that stuff and help you make some informed decisions about how to prioritize your investments.
Awesome. I think that's a great answer. Well, everybody, thank you for joining us today, and thank you especially to the panelists for speaking. I certainly learned a lot. And if you guys have any questions that we weren't able to answer, we'll try to follow up with you afterwards. And have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much. And that concludes our broadcast.